November 19, 1984, 5:30 a.m. San Juanico, PEC, Mexico City. Rosa Martínez, 34 years old, was making breakfast tortillas when she smelled something strange. A sweet, chemical odor drifting through her kitchen window. Her house sat approximately 300 meters from the PEMEX liquefied petroleum gas facility, close enough that she'd grown accustomed to occasional industrial smells, but this morning felt different. The smell was stronger, more pervasive, making her slightly dizzy. "Probably just another leak," she muttered to her husband Miguel as he dressed for his construction job. "They'll fix it." What Rosa Martínez didn't know, what none of the 200,000 people living in the shantytown surrounding the PEMEX facility knew, was that for the past 3 hours, liquefied petroleum gas had been escaping from a ruptured pipeline at the storage terminal. Plant workers had detected the leak around 2:30 a.m. but decided it wasn't serious enough to trigger emergency protocols or evacuate the surrounding neighborhood. They were trying to control it internally, to avoid the expense and disruption of a full shutdown. The irony was suffocating. San Juanico, PEC was one of Mexico City's poorest neighborhoods, a sprawling informal settlement where families built homes from scrap materials on land they didn't own, attracted by proximity to jobs at industrial facilities like PEMEX. The gas terminal had been built in 1964 when the area was largely uninhabited, but as Mexico City's population exploded, desperate families constructed homes closer and closer to the facility, eventually creating a dense shantytown pressing right against the terminal's fence line. PEMEX, Petróleos Mexicanos, Mexico's state-owned petroleum company, operated the San Juanico PEC facility as a major liquefied petroleum gas (LPG) storage and distribution center. The terminal held massive spherical storage tanks, each containing thousands of cubic meters of LPG under pressure. The gas, primarily propane and butane, was used for cooking and heating throughout Mexico City. The facility processed approximately 15,000 cubic meters of LPG daily, supplying a significant portion of the capital's energy needs, but the terminal had problems. Safety inspections conducted in 1983 had identified multiple violations: inadequate spacing between storage tanks, corroded pipelines, missing safety equipment, insufficient worker training. The inspection report recommended immediate repairs and operational changes. PEMEX management acknowledged the report and filed it. Nothing was fixed. Repairs cost money, shutdowns reduced production, the problems were documented but deferred. Plant Supervisor Carlos Hernández was on duty the night of November 18, 1984. Around 2:30 a.m., a pressure alarm indicated a drop in one of the main pipelines connecting the storage tanks to the distribution area. Hernández sent 2 workers to investigate. They found the leak, a 20-centimeter rupture in an 8-inch diameter pipeline carrying LPG from the storage area to the processing units. The workers reported back. Hernández assessed the situation. The leak was significant, visible gas venting, creating a small cloud, but not catastrophic. The affected section could be isolated by closing valves. The leak could be contained and repaired during the day shift without disrupting operations significantly. What Hernández didn't do, what protocol explicitly required but which would have been expensive and disruptive, was trigger the emergency shutdown, activate the warning system, and evacuate the surrounding area. Those were procedures for major emergencies. This was just a leak, manageable, routine, almost. This decision to treat a major LPG leak as a minor operational problem rather than an emergency would kill approximately 500–600 people within the next 3 hours. LPG at atmospheric pressure is a gas, propane and butane in vapor form. But under moderate pressure it liquefies, becoming a dense liquid that occupies much less volume than the gaseous form. This property makes LPG efficient to store and transport. The PEMEX facility stored LPG in its liquid form under pressure in massive spherical tanks called Horton spheres. When LPG escapes from a pressurized system, it immediately begins vaporizing. The liquid becomes gas, expanding to approximately 270 times its liquid volume. A small liquid leak produces a massive gas cloud, and LPG vapor is heavier than air. It doesn't disperse upward but flows downward, accumulating in low areas, filling valleys and depressions, spreading like an invisible flood. Between 2:30 a.m. and 5:45 a.m. on November 19, the ruptured pipeline released an estimated 8,000 to 10,000 cubic meters of liquid LPG. As this liquid vaporized, it created a massive gas cloud, potentially 2.3 million cubic meters of vapor that flowed across the PEMEX facility and into the surrounding neighborhood. The gas was colorless and nearly odorless at high concentrations. LPG normally has an odorant added ethyl mercaptan which smells like rotten eggs to make leaks detectable. But at very high concentrations the odorant becomes less noticeable and the human nose becomes saturated, unable to smell the danger. Rosa Martínez smelled something at 5:30 a.m. but by then the gas cloud was massive and her olfactory system was already saturated with mercaptan. The gas cloud flowed through San Juanico like a silent tide. It filled streets. It crept into homes through windows and door cracks. It displaced oxygen in basements and ground floor rooms. It was invisible, largely odorless at these concentrations and absolutely everywhere, a sea of explosive vapor surrounding 200,000 sleeping people. LPG becomes explosively flammable when mixed with air in concentrations between 2% and 10%. Below 2% there's insufficient fuel for combustion, above 10% there's insufficient oxygen. But in that narrow range any ignition source, a spark, a flame, even a hot surface, triggers explosion. By 5:45 a.m. the gas cloud covered approximately 200 hectares, nearly 500 acres of the industrial facility and surrounding shantytown. Within that area, countless pockets of vapor existed at explosive concentrations. The entire neighborhood was sitting in a potential bomb, waiting for ignition. The ignition came at 5:44 a.m. The exact source was never definitively determined, possibly a car engine starting, possibly someone lighting a cooking fire, possibly an electrical spark from a switch or appliance. Investigators later identified multiple possible ignition points. What mattered wasn't which specific spark triggered the blast, but that ignition was inevitable. With that much explosive vapor spread across that large an area, with thousands of people waking up and starting their daily routines, ignition was a matter of when, not if. The initial explosion occurred at the PEMEX facility itself, somewhere in or near the storage tank area. The blast was massive, equivalent to approximately 5-7 tons of TNT. The shockwave shattered windows 5 kilometers away. In downtown Mexico City, 40 kilometers from San Juanico, people felt the ground shake. But the initial explosion was only the beginning. The blast ignited the entire gas cloud simultaneously. Explosions rippled through the facility and neighborhood like a chain reaction, each pocket of vapor igniting, each explosion triggering others, the entire 200-hectare cloud burning in a matter of seconds. Rosa Martínez was still in her kitchen when the explosion occurred. She remembered seeing a flash of light through the window, feeling a wave of heat, hearing a sound so loud it wasn't really sound anymore, but physical pressure that stunned her senses. Then her house was burning. The walls, thin sheets of corrugated metal and scrap wood, ignited instantly from the thermal pulse. The roof collapsed. She ran toward the door, feeling heat searing her skin, her hair catching fire. She made it outside. Her husband Miguel, still in the bedroom dressing, didn't. The structure collapsed on him, burying him under burning debris. Rosa heard him screaming. She tried to go back but couldn't. The heat was too intense, the smoke too thick. She stumbled into the street, her clothes and skin burning, and saw hell. The entire neighborhood was on fire, not individual buildings but everything, every home, every street, every tree. The explosion had ignited structures across hundreds of acres simultaneously. There were no safe areas, no places untouched by flames. People ran screaming in all directions, many of them on fire, their clothes and hair burning, skin sloughing off from thermal injury. Children wandered through flames looking for parents. Parents searched desperately for children. Entire families were trapped in collapsed burning homes, their screams audible but unreachable. The heat was so intense that metal structures melted, concrete cracked from thermal stress, asphalt roads became viscous liquid. At the PEMEX facility, the destruction was even more complete. The initial explosion had ruptured multiple storage tanks. One tank, containing 1,600 cubic meters of LPG, exploded with such force that fragments were found 2 kilometers away. These weren't small pieces, they were multi-ton sections of tank shell, traveling at ballistic velocities, crashing through buildings and killing everyone in their paths. One fragment, a curved section of tank shell weighing approximately 40 tons, traveled 1.2 kilometers through the air before landing on a row of homes, crushing them flat and killing an estimated 50 people instantly. Another fragment destroyed a school. Another crashed into a marketplace. The PEMEX facility had essentially become an artillery battery, firing massive metal projectiles randomly into the surrounding neighborhood. The facility's firefighting systems designed to suppress fires and cool adjacent tanks to prevent chain reactions were destroyed in the initial explosion. Without cooling, undamaged tanks began heating from flames of burning neighbors. As a tank heats, pressure inside increases. Eventually, pressure exceeds the tank's structural capacity, and it fails catastrophically, a BLEV, or boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion. Over the next hour, 6 more storage tanks experienced BLEVs. Each produced an explosion comparable to the initial blast. Each sent more fragments flying through the neighborhood. Each created new fireballs, massive balls of burning vapor that rose hundreds of meters into the air, visible from across Mexico City, radiating heat that ignited buildings kilometers away. Emergency responders couldn't reach the area. The roads were blocked by debris, burning wreckage and fleeing residents. Fire trucks approaching from Mexico City proper got within 2 kilometers before road damage and flames forced them to stop. Firefighters could only watch as the neighborhood burned, unable to penetrate the inferno. The Mexican military eventually established a perimeter, evacuating survivors and preventing people from entering the disaster zone. But this took hours. The explosion occurred at 5:44 a.m., but organized evacuation didn't begin until after 8 a.m. In the intervening hours, survivors either escaped on their own or died in the flames. Rosa Martínez walked through fire for 40 minutes before reaching the perimeter. Her clothes had burned off. Her skin was charred and blistered across 60% of her body. She was in shock, barely conscious, moving on autopilot towards safety. Military medics found her collapsed at the edge of the disaster zone and transported her to a hospital. She survived, one of approximately 7,000 severely injured by the disaster. Her husband Miguel's body was found 3 days later, identified by dental records because the fire had consumed everything else. He was one of hundreds whose remains were so badly burned that identification was impossible. Mass graves were dug for the unidentifiable dead. The official death toll, released by the Mexican government days after the disaster, was 503. This number was immediately controversial. Unofficial estimates placed deaths between 600 and 2,000. The discrepancy arose from multiple factors. First, San Juanico was an informal settlement. No accurate census existed. Authorities didn't know how many people lived there before the disaster, making it impossible to count how many died. Second, many bodies were completely consumed by fire. The temperatures in the heart of the blaze exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to cremate human remains. Searchers found areas containing ash and bone fragments but no identifiable bodies. How many people those fragments represented was unknowable. Third, entire families died together. Homes collapsed and burned with all occupants inside. If a family of 5 died with no survivors to report them missing, they simply disappeared from record. Fourth, the Mexican government had political incentives to minimize the death toll. PEMEX was state-owned, acknowledging that a government facility killed hundreds or thousands of citizens through negligence would be politically devastating. Official numbers were conservative, likely deliberately so. Most independent analysts estimate actual deaths at 600 metres 700, with some suggesting up to 1,000 is possible. The true number will never be known with certainty. The injury toll was equally catastrophic. Approximately 7,000 people suffered serious injuries requiring hospitalization, primarily severe burns, smoke inhalation injuries, traumatic injuries from explosions and flying debris. Mexico City's hospital system was overwhelmed. Burn units designed for dozens of patients received hundreds. Many injured died days or weeks later from infections, organ failure, or complications from their injuries. The destruction was measured in homes rather than individual structures. An estimated 1,100 homes were completely destroyed, reduced to ash and debris. Another 2,000 homes were severely damaged, partially burned, structurally compromised, uninhabitable. Approximately 40,000 people were left homeless. The PEMEX facility itself was destroyed. Of the 6 major storage tanks, all were either ruptured or severely damaged. Pipelines were destroyed. Processing equipment was melted or blown apart. The damage was so complete that the facility never reopened. The site was eventually decontaminated and converted to other uses but never again stored LPG. The investigation began within days. Multiple agencies were involved: PEMEX internal investigators, Mexican government officials, international safety experts. The findings were damning and comprehensive. The immediate cause, the pipeline rupture that initiated the leak, was attributed to overpressure. A valve malfunction had created pressure exceeding the pipeline's design limits. The pipe, already corroded from years of inadequate maintenance, failed catastrophically. But the pipeline rupture alone didn't cause the disaster. The catastrophe resulted from a cascading series of failures. The pipeline was inadequately maintained. Inspection records showed corrosion identified years earlier but never repaired. The leak detection system was inadequate. Pressure alarms existed but provided no information about leak location or severity. Worker training was insufficient. Night shift personnel weren't trained in emergency response or authorized to trigger facility-wide shutdowns. Supervisor Carlos Hernández made a catastrophic decision not to activate emergency protocols. His training emphasized operational continuity and cost control rather than safety prioritization. The facility layout violated basic safety principles. Storage tanks were too close together, allowing fire to spread from one to another. The facility was too close to residential areas with no buffer zone. No evacuation system existed for the surrounding neighborhood. No warning sirens, no emergency communication, no plans for evacuating 200,000 people. The shantytown itself was illegal and unregulated. Families had built homes on industrial land, creating a deadly proximity between hazardous materials and dense population. Government agencies had failed to enforce regulations. Multiple inspections had identified problems but no authority compelled PEMEX to make corrections. The investigation concluded that the disaster was entirely preventable and resulted from systematic negligence at multiple levels of government and industry. But that conclusion led to minimal accountability. Carlos Hernández, the supervisor who chose not to trigger emergency protocols, was never charged criminally. He lost his job at PEMEX but faced no legal consequences for a decision that contributed to hundreds of deaths. PEMEX management faced no criminal charges. Civil lawsuits were filed but settled for minimal amounts, averaging 20,000 pesos per death, approximately $170 USD at 1984 exchange rates. Government officials faced no consequences. The agencies that had failed to enforce safety regulations, that had allowed shantytown development near hazardous facilities, that had permitted PEMEX to operate despite known safety violations, all continued operating with no accountability. The Mexican government did implement reforms. New regulations required larger buffer zones between hazardous facilities and residential areas. LPG facilities were required to improve safety systems, training and emergency response capabilities. Inspection and enforcement were theoretically strengthened, but enforcement remained inconsistent. Corruption in Mexican regulatory agencies meant that companies could often avoid consequences for violations through bribes or political connections. The same dynamics that produced San Juanico, regulatory capture, cost prioritization over safety, inadequate enforcement, persisted in modified form. The survivors of San Juanico faced decades of struggle. Those with severe burns required multiple surgeries, years of treatment, often resulting in permanent disability and disfigurement. Rosa Martínez underwent 23 surgeries over 15 years to treat burn scars covering 60% of her body. She never worked again. Her injuries left her unable to perform physical labor, and discrimination against visibly burned individuals made employment impossible. She received a settlement of 18,000 pesos, approximately $150 USD, for her injuries and her husband's death. The settlement was meant to compensate for permanent disability, loss of her husband's income, and destruction of her home. It lasted less than 6 months. She spent the rest of her life in poverty, relying on charity and family support, living in housing provided by disaster relief organizations. She died in 2003, at age 53, from complications related to her burn injuries. Her death certificate listed cause as respiratory failure, but the true cause was the explosion 19 years earlier that destroyed her lungs with superheated gas and smoke. Her story repeated thousands of times across the survivor community. People whose lives were destroyed by the disaster, who received minimal compensation, who struggled with disability and poverty for decades, who died prematurely from their injuries. Children orphaned by the disaster faced particularly difficult futures. Many lost both parents, became wards of overwhelmed social services, grew up in institutional care with little support. Studies tracking these children found elevated rates of psychological problems, lower educational attainment, higher poverty rates compared to peers. The disaster's psychological toll was immense and lasting. Survivors developed PTSD at rates comparable to combat veterans, flashbacks of fire and screaming, nightmares, hypervigilance, inability to function normally. Mental health services were limited and culturally stigmatized. Most survivors never received psychological treatment, instead suffering in silence with trauma that never healed. The San Juanico disaster transformed safety regulations globally. International safety organizations studied the disaster extensively, using it as a case study in how industrial facilities near residential areas create catastrophic risk. The concept of domino effect, where one tank explosion triggers others in a chain reaction, became central to safety planning. The disaster also influenced urban planning. Cities worldwide re-evaluated allowing residential development near hazardous facilities. Buffer zones were expanded. Existing facilities too close to neighborhoods were relocated or shut down. The disaster proved that proximity between hazardous industry and dense population was unacceptably dangerous, but these lessons weren't universally applied. Developing nations where regulatory enforcement is weak and land use planning is often informal continued allowing similar situations. In 2015, an explosion at a chemical warehouse in Tianjin, China, killed 173 people in circumstances eerily similar to San Juanico. Hazardous materials stored too close to residential areas, safety violations ignored, workers making poor decisions during an emergency. In 2020, a massive explosion in Beirut, Lebanon, killed 218 people when improperly stored ammonium nitrate detonated near residential neighborhoods. Again, the pattern repeated: hazardous materials near population centers, regulatory failures, catastrophic consequences. The San Juanico disaster's 40th anniversary in 2024 passed with minimal attention in Mexico. No major memorial exists at the site. The area has been redeveloped, new industrial facilities, warehouses, some residential areas rebuilt further from hazardous operations. Few visible traces remain of the disaster that killed 600 people and destroyed a community. This forgetting is typical of industrial disasters. Unlike wars or terrorist attacks that remain in collective memory, industrial catastrophes fade quickly. The disaster is remembered by survivors and families of the dead, but broader society moves on, forgets, allows similar conditions to develop elsewhere. The lesson of San Juanico, that hazardous industrial facilities near dense populations create unacceptable risk, that cost-cutting and regulatory failure kill people, that emergency response requires planning and investment, remains relevant but frequently ignored. Workers ignored the gas leak for hours because shutting down the facility would have been expensive and disruptive. That calculation, prioritizing operational continuity over potential catastrophic risk, killed approximately 500 people when inevitable ignition turned a manageable leak into an inferno that consumed a neighborhood. The explosion lasted seconds, the fires burned for hours, the consequences persist for generations. And the fundamental dynamics that created San Juanico: industrial hazards near vulnerable populations, regulations unenforced, warnings ignored, until disaster proves their necessity, continue operating globally, waiting for the next ignition, the next explosion, the next 500 dead. The political reckoning following San Juanico was swift in rhetoric but minimal in substance. Mexican President Miguel de la Madrid visited the disaster site within 24 hours, walking through still smoldering ruins while cameras captured his solemn expression. He promised comprehensive investigation, justice for victims, and reforms to prevent recurrence. The promises sounded decisive. The follow-through was not. PEMEX as a state-owned enterprise had unique legal protections that shielded it from the accountability private companies might face. The doctrine of sovereign immunity limited lawsuits against government entities. Victims could file claims, but compensation was capped by statute at minimal levels. Criminal prosecution of government employees required approval from their agencies, meaning PEMEX would essentially have to prosecute itself. This legal framework ensured that the most egregious negligence resulted in the least accountability. The corroded pipeline that ruptured. Maintenance records showed it had been flagged for repair in 1981, 1982, and 1983. Each time repairs were deferred due to budget constraints. 3 years of documented warnings, 3 years of choosing to defer repairs, and the consequence was a rupture that killed 500 people, yet no one faced criminal charges for that decision. Carlos Hernández, the supervisor who spent 3 hours treating a massive LPG leak as a minor operational problem, became the disaster's sole scapegoat, but even he escaped criminal liability. PEMEX fired him, citing failure to follow emergency protocols. He lost his pension. But he was never charged with negligent homicide or reckless endangerment. The decision that most directly contributed to the disaster, not evacuating despite a known major gas leak, was treated as an employment matter rather than a criminal act. The families of victims organized, demanding accountability and compensation. They formed the Committee of Victims of San Juanico, led by survivors like Rosa Martínez who'd lost everything: family members, homes, health, livelihood. The committee petitioned the government, demonstrated in front of PEMEX headquarters, filed lawsuits. They demanded compensation reflecting actual damages, lost income over lifetimes, medical costs for severe burn treatment, psychological trauma, destroyed homes. The government offered 20,000 pesos per death, approximately $170 USD at the time, equivalent to about 2 months' wages for a working-class Mexican. For severe injuries, compensation ranged from 5,000 to 15,000 pesos depending on disability level. Rosa Martínez, with 60% burns covering her body, was awarded 18,000 pesos total, for injuries requiring decades of treatment, for losing her husband, for permanent disability that would prevent her from ever working again. The committee rejected these amounts as insulting. They organized strikes, occupied government buildings, gained media attention. For months they fought for justice. They won minor increases. Deaths were eventually compensated at 35,000 pesos, severe injuries at up to 25,000 pesos. Still grossly inadequate, but it was all the legal system would provide. Many victims never received even these minimal payments. The claims process was bureaucratic, requiring documentation that many informal settlement residents didn't possess: property deeds for homes built illegally, employment records for informal labor, death certificates for bodies never identified. Approximately 40% of eligible families never successfully navigated the claims process and received nothing. The international response highlighted the disaster's global implications. The International Labour Organization sent investigators who concluded that San Juanico represented a systemic failure in industrial safety typical of rapidly industrializing nations where economic growth outpaced regulatory capacity. The United Nations Environment Programme used San Juanico as a case study for its recommendations on hazardous facility sitting. The technical investigation revealed design and operational failures that shocked international safety experts. The facility's layout, with large storage tanks spaced only 15 meters apart, violated international standards requiring 30 per safety meter spacing to prevent domino effects. The facility lacked proper fire suppression systems, automated shutdown capabilities, or adequate monitoring equipment. Worker training consisted of brief orientation sessions rather than comprehensive safety education. Most damningly, the investigation found that PEMEX management was aware of these deficiencies. Internal memos from 1982 and 1983 discussed the facility's safety problems, estimated costs of corrections at approximately $2 million USD, and concluded that risk of catastrophic failure was low probability, and therefore upgrades were not cost justified. This cost-benefit analysis, $2 million to potentially prevent disaster versus accepting small risk of catastrophic loss, was documented in writing, preserved in files, later entered into evidence at inquiries. The calculation proved catastrophically wrong. The disaster's economic cost far exceeded preventive investment, property destruction estimated at $20 million, medical costs of $15 million, compensation payments of $10 million, lost production and facility reconstruction costs of $50 million. Total economic impact approached $100 million, 50 times the cost of safety upgrades that would have prevented the disaster. But this economic analysis ignores the incalculable 500 lives, thousands permanently disabled, 40,000 made homeless, a community destroyed. No dollar value adequately captures that cost. The $2 million safety investment should have been made because it would save lives, not because it was economically rational. But PEMEX's decision-making framework treated human life as another variable in cost-benefit calculations, and when probability of disaster was assessed as low, human life was discounted accordingly. The regulatory reforms following San Juanico looked impressive on paper. Mexico passed the General Law of Ecological Balance and Environmental Protection in 1988, establishing comprehensive environmental regulations and creating enforcement agencies. Specific regulations for LPG facilities required improved safety systems, better training, larger buffer zones between industrial facilities and residential areas. The reforms were hailed as transformative, as Mexico joining the developed world's commitment to environmental and industrial safety. But implementation lagged behind legislation. The new regulatory agencies were understaffed and underfunded. Inspectors were poorly paid, making them susceptible to corruption. Companies could often avoid compliance through bribes to inspectors or political connections that prevented enforcement actions. The laws existed, but their enforcement was inconsistent at best. This pattern, impressive legislation followed by minimal enforcement, is common in developing nations where regulatory capacity hasn't kept pace with industrial development. Laws are passed in response to disasters, creating appearance of action without the institutional capacity or political will to ensure compliance. The result is safety theater. Regulations that exist on paper but don't change actual industrial practices significantly. 20 years after San Juanico in 2004, a safety audit of Mexico's LPG facilities found widespread violations of post-San Juanico regulations. Facilities lacked required safety equipment. Buffer zones were ignored. Worker training was inadequate. The reforms inspired by 500 deaths had been undermined by the same dynamics that caused those deaths: cost pressures, regulatory capture, enforcement failures. The survivor community struggled long after the disaster faded from headlines. Rosa Martínez's story typified their experience. Her burn injuries required continuous medical treatment, surgeries to release contractures, skin grafts, treatment for chronic infections. Mexico's public health system provided basic care, but specialized treatment required payment she couldn't afford. Charitable organizations helped, but coverage was incomplete and unpredictable. The psychological trauma was equally debilitating and even less treated. Rosa experienced nightmares of fire and screaming every night for years. Loud noises triggered panic attacks. The smell of smoke, ubiquitous in Mexico City with its millions of cooking fires, caused immediate flashbacks. She developed depression, became isolated, lost the will to engage with life. Mental health services were scarce and culturally stigmatized. She suffered silently, as did thousands of other survivors. Children who survived the disaster but lost parents faced particularly difficult trajectories. Many ended up in institutional care, orphanages, overwhelmed by sudden influx of children, poorly funded, unable to provide adequate support. Studies tracking these children into adulthood found elevated rates of poverty, lower educational attainment, higher rates of substance abuse and mental health problems. The disaster's effects echoed across generations. Children traumatized and orphaned grew into struggling adults who then raised their own children in difficult circumstances. The physical site of the disaster tells its own story of memory and forgetting. Immediately after the explosion, the Mexican government declared the area uninhabitable and planned to relocate all residents. Temporary camps were established. Plans were drawn for new housing developments away from industrial zones. The victims would receive proper homes, government subsidized, in safe areas. But the relocation proceeded slowly and incompletely. Funding was insufficient, bureaucracy delayed, and many residents, despite everything, wanted to return. San Juanico had been their home, their community, their social network. The temporary camps were crowded, unpleasant, far from jobs and schools. Within months, families began returning to the disaster site, clearing debris, rebuilding homes. The government lacked resources or will to prevent this return. Within 2 years, much of the destroyed area had been reoccupied. Not by the same people, many original residents were dead or had moved away, but by new migrants, new families desperate for any housing they could afford, even if that housing sat atop ground where 500 people had burned to death. Today the area is densely populated again. New industrial facilities operate nearby, not LPG storage but other hazardous operations. The cycle has repeated. Industrial jobs attract poor families, informal settlements develop, proximity between hazardous facilities and vulnerable populations is recreated. A small memorial plaque marks the disaster site, but most current residents are unaware of what happened there 40 years ago. This pattern of disaster, reform, then gradual reversion to dangerous conditions appears globally. The Bhopal gas disaster in India killed 3,800 people in 1984, the same year as San Juanico, when methyl isocyanate leaked from a pesticide plant. Reforms were promised, regulations passed. But decades later, hazardous facilities in India still operate near dense populations, safety standards are poorly enforced, and the conditions that produced Bhopal persist. The 2015 Tianjin explosion in China killed 173 people when a chemical warehouse storing hazardous materials too close to residential areas exploded. The parallels to San Juanico were exact: improper storage, regulatory failures, proximity to population. China implemented reforms after Tianjin. Whether those reforms prevent the next disaster remains to be seen. The 2020 Beirut explosion killed 218 people when 2,750 tons of improperly stored ammonium nitrate detonated in a port warehouse near residential neighborhoods. Again, hazardous materials, inadequate safety, proximity to population, catastrophic explosion. The pattern repeats because the underlying dynamics, economic pressure to cut costs, regulatory capture, prioritization of short-term profit over long-term safety, are difficult to eliminate. The San Juanico disaster's ultimate lesson is that industrial safety isn't achieved through laws and regulations alone but requires sustained enforcement, adequate resources, political will, and cultural commitment to prioritizing human life over operational convenience. Carlos Hernández had 3 hours to make a different decision: to trigger emergency protocols, to evacuate the neighborhood, to prioritize safety over avoiding disruption. He chose wrong because his training, his incentives, his organizational culture all pushed toward minimizing operational interruption rather than maximizing safety. That culture, the institutional mindset that treats safety procedures as obstacles to efficiency, that encourages workers to avoid overreacting to problems, that rewards keeping production running despite concerns, exists wherever industrial facilities operate under economic pressure. Changing that culture requires more than regulations, it requires leadership commitment, resource investment, worker empowerment, and accountability when failures occur. San Juanico had none of those. And 500 people died because a gas leak was treated as a manageable operational problem rather than the emergency it was, because supervisor discretion prioritized production over precaution, because 3 hours of delay transformed a containable leak into an explosion that consumed a neighborhood. The memorial that doesn't exist at San Juanico should state simply, here died approximately 500 people because warnings were ignored, because safety was deferred, because human life was calculated as less valuable than operational continuity. Their deaths changed nothing that endures. The same decisions are still made, the same calculations still favor production over precaution. Remember them, and understand that until those calculations change, the next San Juanico is only a matter of time and location. Rosa Martínez died in 2003 at age 53, her body destroyed by burns that never healed, her life destroyed by a disaster that was entirely preventable, that was predicted in safety reports filed and ignored, that killed her husband and left her disfigured and disabled, and that compensated her suffering with $150. And promises of reform that were never fully realized. She is remembered by her surviving children, by other victims' families, by the small community of San Juanico survivors, who gather annually on November 19th, to read names of the dead and stand in silence for the seconds it took for ignition to become inferno. But she is forgotten by broader society, by the regulatory agencies that failed to protect her, by the PEMEX management that chose operational continuity over her safety. The gas leak began at 2:30 a.m. For 3 hours it could have been stopped. For 3 hours decisions could have been made differently. For 3 hours 500 lives could have been saved. Instead, those 3 hours became a countdown to inevitable ignition, to explosion, to fire, to death. Workers ignored the gas leak for hours, until 500 people burned alive, and the world learned nothing that endures because decades later the same decisions are still made, the same leaks are still ignored, the same calculations still value production over human life. San Juanico's legacy isn't the reforms it inspired but the warning it provides, that industrial disasters aren't accidents but consequences of choices, and that until those choices change, the next 500 dead are waiting in another neighborhood, near another facility, where another supervisor will face another leak and make another calculation about whether operational disruption justifies emergency response. History suggests that calculation will be wrong, the leak will be ignored, the explosion will occur, the bodies will be counted, and the cycle will continue.